a Saturday night in the deep sounds. They bang hip-hop, gridlocked in Greektown. The beat cops looking for somebody to beat down. They got no control, who's running the streets now? They shutting all the schools and the factories been closed.
What's up, everybody? This is episode 3 of the qWARRENtine. My name's Warren Peace. On today's show, I interviewed Rob St. Mary, who is a broadcast journalist in Detroit, as well as someone who is a kind of a archivist, historian. He has a book out that's called it's an anthology of Orbit magazine, which was an underground weekly kind of culture magazine, similar to an alt weekly as they call them. And then there was, actually I think it was monthly now that I think about it. I think he said it was monthly. Anyway, you can read the anthology and find out. You can find that in the links in the show notes and purchase that book through Wayne State University Press. He also has a website devoted to the history of Detroit punk rock, and that link will also be in the show notes. It's a really cool website to check out. So I'm a little bit behind posting this. I interviewed Rob on April 11th. Today's April 16th. But it's kind of interesting timing because Rob's a journalist, and we talked quite a bit about journalism and the challenges of that industry, and the issues with people kind of not believing the things that they see and hear in the media and read, and also the sort of echo chambers that people live in where they don't see information that doesn't agree with their point of view. And the reason why it's kind of apropos is yesterday here in Michigan, there was a big rally at the state capitol of people who were protesting Governor Whitmer's stay-at-home order. And it's really, a lot of the posts that I saw from those people and a lot of interviews that were done on the scene made it clear that they're not really either getting the information that a lot of other people are about the dangers of this pandemic, or they just don't believe it because the news sources, they don't trust the news media at all. And so it's a very interesting backdrop to this conversation with Rob. And before I get into that, I just wanted to read something, kind of my view on the protest yesterday. I posted this online, and a lot of people shared it and commented on it, and so maybe you'll find it worthwhile, but it's pretty short. I said, if you support protesting the, quote, tyranny of pandemic restrictions, but have nothing to say about police murdering black people, mass incarceration, educational inequality, environmental racism, or endless war, then you're clearly using anti-government rhetoric as a cover for only caring about your own self-interest. And that's kind of what I think about this protest. I think that a lot of people are mad because their lives are being disrupted. They're scared, rightfully so, because they don't have any income, and they don't feel like there's enough help coming from the government. Many of us got $1,200 one-time checks, and people are getting more in unemployment than before, but there's a lot of issues with navigating all of that, and it doesn't really make up for the wages that a lot of people make, and business owners are really affected. But at the same time, my family's dealing with that. My wife is a independent contractor, and her income went from very good to nothing overnight. And so so we're not happy about that, but at the same time we feel that this is a public health crisis, and we have to do what we can, and everybody's doing their best to navigate it as best they can. And it's very strange how there's all this protesting in Michigan when there's 44 other states with these types of restrictions. Many of those states have Republican governors. and the people out there were, it was a big Trump rally. Essentially, it was a lot of people with Trump flags and stuff like that. So it really was unclear exactly what they were protesting, because they weren't saying, hey, we want, it was unclear if they want the state. A lot of them sounded like they just want the state completely reopened, which is just not possible yet, in the point that we're at in this pandemic, and really showed a lack of understanding of the issue, which isn't, to say that they're not smart. This is a complicated issue. I don't understand everything about it, but I also don't think that I have all the answers, and that we should just go against what all these public health officials and doctors and scientists are recommending. And yes, there are dissenting voices, but there's dissenting voices for everything. So we have to do the best we can to find consensus and do what we need to do. And so anyhow, that's kind of the backdrop to this conversation with Rob. Rob and I met. It's funny, he also mentions Craigslist in this interview, and how it kind of it had to do, it played a role in the demise of newspapers, because it kind of took away from their advertising revenue and their classified ads, excuse me. And so Rob talked about that, and it's funny because we met basically through Craigslist. I was searching for band members when I was starting to be a performing musician, and Rob answered the call as a bass player. And so Rob played bass in my band that was called the Freematics. We formed, I think, in late 2008, played in 2009. I don't know if we went into 2010, but anyhow, that was how we met, and we've stayed in touch all these years. And Rob does really interesting work, and he's a big lover of the city, a big supporter of local arts and music, and someone who has just been a good friend. Type of person to send you a book randomly. He sent me a book about the rise of national populism, which is a very good book. I'm still haven't finished it. I think I'm about halfway through it, but it's really interesting. And he's just a deep thinker, and a guy who knows a lot about the industry that he's in, and about Detroit history. So it was good to talk to him. There is some technical issues with the interview, because we were using Zoom, and my internet was a little bit choppy at times. So there's some glitches here and there, but we do the best we can in this quarantine situation. So anyway, this is my interview with Rob St. Mary from April 11th, and hope you enjoy it. All right, Rob St. Mary, welcome to the quarantine. This is episode 3. Good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. And, just before this, I realized we've known each other 11 years.
11 years. Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, so we were...
That's a quarter. It's almost a quarter of my life.
That's wild. Yeah, it's weird, because it seems like yesterday, and it seems like a really long time ago at the same time, kind of.
Yeah.
So we were in a band together, very bright, burning, short-lived experience, called the Freematics, that was a trip. It was a fun time while we were doing it. And yeah, are you still like fiddling around with the bass at all, or?
Yeah, I've played guitar. I originally picked up guitar when I was like 14, I think. I sold my comic book collection originally to buy my first guitar, and when I did that, I think I had invested maybe $150, and I think I got about $300, because I have this. There was a guy who became kind of like a older brother to me. I was raised an only child, and I used to go to this flea market not too far from my house, and he had a comic book stand. And during the week, he worked in a shop, but he would get comic books, and he would sell stuff out of his collection and get new stuff. And I would hang out there on weekends, because that's when it was open. And Mark at the time was like, buy this and buy this and buy 2 of those and all this, so that like a few years later, like 2 or 3 years later, I sold it all and I was able to buy a decent guitar. So that was my first guitar, and I started taking lessons. I also sold my video game systems then too, and I used
Oh
to have a
wow,
couple of them. And just
you were
because
really serious.
yeah, I mean, I really understood sort of how obsessive I can be about certain things. Like when I really get into something, I really get into it. And I was really into video games, and I'm like, if I'm so I even knew at like 14 I had to get rid of that stuff. And you know, I've fiddled around with game systems since then, but you know, music's really always been my thing. And even earlier than that, my creative outlet was originally poetry, really bad poetry, but still. And so that's really what it's been about. And you know, being an only child, you know, it was a great companion. That and film, like
Yeah,
just as soon as we got a VCR, it was great. So that was the
yeah.
big thing for me.
I'm not sure I ever left the bad poetry phase, but uh, yeah, I want to circle back to music in a minute, but before that, where in the world are you right now?
Well, I am in my home office. This is on the second floor of my house. I live in Hamtramck, and we bought this place almost 2.5 years ago, my wife and I. And I love it down here. I originally, when I met you, I was living in a house in Harper Woods. I was actually married to my first wife at the time. That didn't work out. We ended up splitting a few years later. But I ended up selling that house, and I moved into an apartment down here. And then I moved to Colorado. I got an opportunity to work in public radio out there in 2013. So I moved to Aspen, and I was there from 2013 to 2015. And then I moved back to Detroit. And as soon as I could, I moved back to Hamtramck, and I've lived here basically solidly for almost 5 years. And
Yeah,
what I really love about Hamtramck is you can walk everywhere. There's vibrancy. You know, work at home now, you know, but when I had another job before this one that I'm at now, used to work at home quite a bit. And it's great because you can walk to the grocery store, you can walk to the restaurant, you can walk to the bar, post office, everything you need is here. And it's all compact within about 2 square miles. So I love it down here, and it has a vibrancy that I didn't grow up around. When I grew up in sort of the south end. At the time, it wasn't called Clinton Township, but it became Clinton Township, and it was on Gratiot between 14 and 15 mile. So it was sort of the south end of what people would consider Mount Clemens, or the north end of Roseville per se. And it was basically just, you know, 100 homes that looked the same on a street with a strip mall on the end. And this is not very interesting. And there wasn't really vibrancy, like people on the street or walking to the store. And that's why I love it down here.
yeah. For people who don't know Detroit, Hamtramck's like a 2 square mile city, completely surrounded by Detroit on all sides, and historically, and you can make any corrections here, but historically it's been a Polish community, a lot of Polish immigrants, but now it's sort of, I kind of compare it to like the Lower East Side of Detroit. Like it's an immigrant community. So there's a lot of Yemeni folks, there's a lot of Bangladeshi folks, there's just a lot of diversity, a lot of people who this is their first stop in America. Houses are very, very close together. So it reminds me of the East Coast a lot, like more than probably anywhere else in Michigan. And I like it too. I love going down there just because, like you said, there's people around, there's all kinds of great different types of food. There's all kinds of resale shops and places that are just kind of funky, interesting shops. And I have a lot of friends that live there. So I've spent, and obviously having played music for a while, there's a lot of venues, and I've probably I'd say like half of the top 10 shows I've ever done were probably in Hamtramck. So yeah, I really like it too. And how's it going with your friends and family and community with this global pandemic we're living through right now?
Well, you know, my mom, I texted with my mom yesterday, and she said that a good friend of hers, her son died, and he was 34 this week.
Wow.
So that's one of the closest kind of connections. So that's kind of 2 hours from me, of in the community that have also died who are kind of connected through others, or I've known of them, but I didn't know them personally. So for example, actually my state rep here in Hamtramck, Isaac Robinson, who was the state rep
Yeah.
for Detroit and part of Detroit and all of Hamtramck, he died, I think it was 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I got to know Isaac during the Obama campaign. He was an organizer for the Young Democrats at the time, and a union guy. And so I was really sad to hear. I mean, it was actually, I didn't realize how many people I know knew him until, I mean, he was a super connected guy. And that was really, really a tough loss for a lot of people in Detroit. He was someone who spent his whole life dedicated to helping out the city, and was a real man of the people. So yeah, that was a bummer for sure.
Yeah, so I didn't know him personally. I'd, been in the room a few times with him, but I wouldn't consider him a friend. I wouldn't, he wouldn't know me by name per se. As for someone that I know personally who got ill, and I've got a podcast that I do for WWJ where I work. That's my day job. And I do news for them Monday through Friday. I write stories and help produce mornings. I also have a podcast that I do for them that I've been doing since December called In Depth. And In Depth typically is one topic, usually spend about a half hour. So it was much more planned until about a month ago. And about a month ago, all of this started to happen. And then I realized, okay, all these shows that I had planned for the next 2 months just need to move off. And I did. And over the last 2 weeks, so sort of week 3 and 4 so far that I've done, the first one was, and the reason why I'm kind of explaining this is I interviewed a good friend of mine, a friend who I've known for over half my life. I've known her for over 20 years. And she's a nurse in town. I'm not going to say what hospital. I'm not going to give her name or anything like that, because some medical systems have gone after nurses for just posting even on social media about, being burned out at the end of the day. Or there was one who was just suiting up and just showing everything that, that she was wearing in order to handle this in the hospital. And the hospital system's like, you can't do that. So I don't want to jeopardize anyone's career. I don't want to jeopardize anyone's job. But really what's more important is the information that they were telling. And so I interviewed with her, and she explained how she got a case of COVID-19. And not only that, but she had come home, and in that incubation period, which we now know can be up to 5 days, sometimes even longer, where you're a carrier, but you may not have any symptoms, she also ended up infecting her son who lives with her. And he's 25 years old and he's a grad student. So the two of them were convalescing for about 10 days. I sent, she called me, I went over and I dropped off some things for her. But the first week I interviewed with her, and I was just sort of like, okay, tell me how you're feeling. How did this come on? Explain it to me, And then she explained sort of what was the, what was the lead up? Like, how was the hospital handling it? How was their floor handling it? As an ER nurse, how were they handling it? And then last week I talked to her, and she had just been cleared that day to go back to work. So she went back to work a few days ago after just having symptoms really hit 10 days earlier. She was still coughing and fatigued, but they were like, you're cleared to go. You haven't had a fever in 3 days, and you're not taking any medication to dull any of that. You're not on pain relievers or anything. So that was the second episode. So that's this week's episode of the show, where I kind of follow up with her, and we talk a lot about this. Well, can you infect others? Can you be reinfected, with a different strain, kind of like the flu or something like that? So she has been the closest person to me who was taken ill. So that was really hard to take, because I was concerned for both of them, both her and her son, because I've known her son since he was in a high chair. I mean, I met him when he was a 4-year-old kid,
Right.
He just actually came over to this house. On the first floor, I'm rehabbing my house, and he came through and did the wiring for me. He's working to become an electrical engineer. So it was just very hard for me for a couple of days to handle that. And I'm glad they're on the mend, and everything works out. But, you don't know, because, as I said, my mom's friend, her son was 34. Isaac Robinson was, I believe, 43, which is only a year older than me. So, we definitely know that the fatality rates are higher based on the state numbers here in Michigan for people in their 70s. But as she was telling me, a lot of people that are coming into her ER are people in their 30s, in their 40s. And, a lot of them end up walking eventually, but, very severe respiratory issues and pneumonias.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's I've known a couple people. I knew one person I can't really say I knew him, but he was like a security guard someplace that I go once a week, and he passed away. And then the woman who hired me into the school district I work for had it, and it was really concerning because she's had a history of pneumonia and bronchitis and sort of lung issues, and she had a really hard time with it, and I was worried about her for a while, but she's recovered for the most part. And I had a neighbor too who had it, and his case was pretty mild. So he said it was, he basically compared it to having the flu, and he got better. But it's kind of crazy because it's sort of, you just don't know, and there's no telling who's gonna, there's statistics, but statistics aren't 100% of the people. So, there's always the outliers who don't seem to have any other health concerns, and they're young, and, that can be anyone. So, so I want to talk about journalism a little bit, because that's your career, and I think it relates in a lot of ways to this, to what we're going through in terms of how people are getting their information and all that. But before we dig into that, like, what's I have no idea, like, the story of how you got into journalism and sort of what drove that. Like, did you go to school for it? Was that what you always wanted to do, or did you kind of fall into it, or what's the narrative?
Yeah, I can give you the tour. The thing that's funny is when a few years ago, the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan took some material related to a project that I did. And then as part of that, they offered me an opportunity to have my own piece of the archive there at the University of Michigan, to build my own archive of material that I've done over the years. And when I did that, I went back and I looked at everything that I had done. Because I have this kind of and I like to tell this story in reference to my own work, is that for many years, they kept finding these beautiful carved jade pieces on sort of that ice land bridge between, the upper part of Siberia and into, across the Bering Strait and into Alaska. And these, archaeologists and various people were out there, and they were digging these pieces of jade out. And they were like, wow, these things are really beautiful. And what they found was that it was people who were crossing, obviously, from Asia into Alaska, and they would just sit there and carve these things, and when they were just to kind of pass the time, and then just throw them over their shoulder and keep walking. And what I kind of learned was I really hadn't understand the full totality of the work that I had done, or sort of where any of this really began, until I went and dug through that pile I had behind me.
Right.
So I had this massive pile of stuff. I kind of started digging through, and I go, well, kind of, where did this all begin? And if I was going to kind of peg it, ultimately, sort of the proto version, or the embryonic stage of it, was really my father. Like, I have to give all credit to my dad. My dad and my mom both had an interest in things like, when I was a kid, I didn't have cable. I grew up kind of working poor and watched a lot of PBS. But beyond that, my dad had an interest in genealogy. So he started researching family history. He would drag me through graveyards. We'd do rubbings on gravestones. We would go to the library, go through microfilm, microfiche, look at old newspapers, try to find obituaries, stories about dead relatives who died 100, 150 years earlier, and kind of understand this larger story of, who we are and where we come from, and kind of trace it back. And through him, I've been able to trace back, our family lineage to about sometime in the 1500s. So we've got this history, and we're very lucky to have that history, because I understand there's a lot of people who don't have that history, But anyway, I learned kind of from him, kind of research and to look things up, questions, that it's okay to ask questions and learn things. So really, that's where that came from. But when I was in high school, there's kind of two things that kind of pushed me on path, and I never really realized it until I went back and looked at it. One thing was, I was kind of looking for kind of a blow-off class, and I ended up joining the school newspaper. Was a class you could take, and I hated it, because the guy who was the teacher who taught it, it was just supposed to be kind of a house organ for the administration, and I didn't like that. I liked the idea of trying to get my fellow students to kind of talk about life or the things that mattered to them. But when we tried to do that, he would censor us. So, for example, I remember one issue, we put out kind of surveys, and we asked kids about, things they were concerned about. And we got back these, beautiful responses about, like, dating and sexuality, and like someone got pregnant and another one had to have an abortion, and like all of this stuff, and just sort of this emotional stuff that they were dealing with, like trying to figure out how they were going to become adults and like go get a career, when they're going to go to school, and all of this stuff. And it was just beautiful. And he wouldn't run it. And he was afraid of running some of that for the parents to get upset at the administration. So what we did, we were kind of WikiLeaks before WikiLeaks, in that we kind of jailbroke some of that stuff and made our own underground newspaper that we printed at the local Kinko's. So what we found out in the sort of the code of conduct in the high school was, you could give away literature, but you couldn't get money for it. You couldn't sell anything on the school property without the authorization of the school principal and the administration. So what we would do is we'd sit in the lunchroom, and one guy would have a stack of these newspapers, and the next guy next to him would just take money. So I would just hand the paper to the person, and then they would hand the money to the guy next to me. Now the administration would go, "Hey, you're charging for that. We can shut you down." And I go, I don't know why they're handing him money. I have no idea why they're handing that guy money. All I'm doing is handing out these papers. And it says in the code of conduct that I can hand out literature on the schoolyard. So it's in the code of conduct. We're not charging for it. So, we would do things in there, like, for example, for Halloween, my friend who was an artist, who was also co-editor with me, drew his face, and we attached a piece of string on the back, so you could have your own Halloween mask that was actually the principal of the school. So any way that we could basically say "fuck you" to the authority, we did. And a lot of this was informed by, as you know, I went to write a book about Orbit magazine here in Detroit, which was a great sort of alt paper from the 90s, from 90 to 99. They had this real kind of punk rock sensibility, which we totally loved when we were doing this in late 95 through, middle of the year until we graduated in 1996, which is when I graduated high school. So it really kind of starts there in terms of the broadcast aspect, where I went from, okay, let's print something and let's work for a newspaper, to let's get into broadcast. I hadn't really thought about it, but we had a public access cable station at our school. It wasn't really well publicized that we had this. They didn't spend a lot of money to publicize it or to like train kids how to do it. But a couple of us who were actually like in the drama club found out, and we went down there, and we'd do like stupid little short films, or try to get the cameras out and do stuff. And at that time, like 1995, I mean, that was a big deal, because those cameras were expensive, right? Now you can shoot whatever you want on your phone, and it's easy. I mean, everybody's fucking Steven Spielberg now, compared to what you had to go 25 years ago. So,
yeah, somebody posted in my
but one of the things with
I was just gonna say, somebody posted from my graduating class, like our like class video, and it was really funny, because it's just like there's so much bad footage that like made the cut because you just had to use what you had, and there was no like you didn't even really know what you had until you went and sat down to edit it. And you're working with like tape, and it's like it was so much longer than like a video like that would have been today. And it had like
Oh,
really no context or like narrative or anything. It was a bunch of
it,
random clips of people being in different places in the school with like music underneath it.
yeah. Well, it's funny that you bring that up because that is the place where I was going. Was we had a video yearbook for my junior and senior year. How I got picked for this assignment, I can't even remember really. But it was like one of the school dances. It was like either homecoming or something. And for some reason, whoever was working the camera said, "You come here." And it was my job to interview everyone. So I interviewed the homecoming, the homecoming board and all of this, and kind of talking to the camera and all this. And I'm like, it's right there. I'm like, between my kind of punk rock attitude, do it yourself little Xerox zine, and doing interviews on camera for the school yearbook video, I'm like, it's right there. Like I had never even I didn't even think about it later until I go, that's the earliest genesis point of my career. So, but I didn't go like right from high school into broadcast journalism. It just didn't happen that fast. For me, originally, I was going to be a high school English teacher. And then kind of my senior year, I had a teacher who I really respect, and I haven't talked to her in a while, but I used to for a while, engage with her, send letters and things like that from time to time. And she said to me, unless you really want to teach, don't teach. And was what she said. She goes, I'm not trying to dissuade you. She's just like, you really have to have an interest in children and caring about them and wanting to impart knowledge and be willing to put up with the bureaucracy and all of the things that you'll have to deal with if you're going to work in a public school setting. And she goes, unless you're willing to do that, don't do it as a backup job. Because she knew that I had a real creative streak. And I figured, at the time I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be like, or work in film. So I'm like, well, I could write or direct, or I could write novels or something. And then that'll be the day job. And it'll be a good day job. And then sort of in summer, I can do my thing, or on nights and weekends, I can do my thing. And so originally it was go to school and learn to be a high school English teacher was the plan. And after kind of the first year of going to school, it just wasn't working. And then I had a personal tragedy in that my grandmother was diagnosed with a brain tumor when I was 19. And when she was diagnosed, I had to quit school anyway. So my folks were working opposite shifts. I was the only child. We moved her in. And for about 5 months, I was her basically day companion and care person with help from hospice. So I'm like a 19-year-old kid, 20-year-old kid, helping my grandmother who has a brain tumor, can't really talk, but was an amazingly lucid person, very intelligent person, used to read, knit, do crossword puzzles. This is my mother's mother from Scotland, and was just, love her dearly. But I had to quit school. And in that same time, just before she took ill, over the summer and into the early fall, there were some guys that I had done a play with at Macomb Community College in my senior year of high school. I'd taken some acting classes. And those guys had some money, they had a script, they wanted to make a film. So we made this silly little vampire movie when I was like 19 years old. And I edited that. I basically was editing sound reels in my bedroom on actual tape while my grandmother was dying in the next bedroom next to me. And her death really kind of blew a hole in me the way that I had a friend die a few years earlier in high school, that kind of grief. And when I got to sort of the other end of this and I had completed this film, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it took me until I was about 22, 23 to finally go, I think I know what I want to do. Like I had done a bunch of odd jobs. I worked at a movie theater, worked at a video store, I worked at a bookstore. I'd done all these odd jobs and I just couldn't quite figure out what I wanted. And I had a friend of mine actually who was a DJ. And he had gone to Specs Howard, which is a broadcast school here in Southfield, in the Detroit area. And this year, actually, they celebrate their 50th anniversary. They started in 1970 originally. And so I went there and I went specifically for radio, and I went for radio news. And I was the only one in my class who went for radio news. And for a long time, I was the only one who had a job out of my class. Because I knew at the time that if you were going to go into radio and you were going to go to music radio, there was a lot of computer programs that allowed someone to voice track and be on multiple stations at once. So they could do breaks on, a dozen stations a day across a company that maybe owns, in the case of one company I worked for, they own 1,500 stations across the country. So I thought to myself, right, if one guy's got a job and he's doing 6 jobs or 7 jobs, that's 6 or 7 jobs I'm not going to get. Mm-hmm. So what is a job, if you wanted to get into broadcast, that would be of value, that you could say, right, you can't really be replaced by a robot, to do this job. And that would be news. I figured people are always going to need information there, be it reporting or weather, traffic, or whatever. They're going to need up-to-date information. And that's why I got into that. Now, I had some people who went through Specs and they went through the TV end, who went into work in TV. And the reason why I never went into TV was kind of twofold. One, I don't necessarily like being on camera so much. And then the other thing is TV is very by committee. The great thing about being in radio, and specifically radio news, it's just me and a microphone. Mm-hmm. I go out, I talk to that person, I cut that tape, I write that story, bam, it's done. When you're in TV, it's like you and a cameraman, and then you got to take it back. And if you don't edit it, then there's an editor, and then there's a producer. Like there's like 5 different people involved sometimes in just one story. And you may only do 1 story a day, mm-hmm. Maybe 2 if you're lucky, because there's so much involved in terms of the visuals. So for me, I had always been an NPR listener and grew up listening to WDET. So that's what I did. I went to broadcast, and I got into broadcast school. And then I basically kind of learned on the job, and I learned from a lot of great people. I had a lot of great mentors. I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books on media theory. So even though I don't have a 4-year degree in broadcast journalism or anything like that, everything I learned was by doing and by talking to others and understanding what had come down before, understanding also for myself. Like, remember when I talked about making that film? When I made that film, there were stories that were written in the paper about us making the movie. And there were little things that they either got wrong, such as the caption on the photo where they reversed myself and the other guy I produced it with, to what quotes they decided to pull and which ones they didn't. So I learned early that, I didn't like the way people wrote about me, mm-hmm. And because they wrote about me, I was like, I wouldn't have written it like that. So for me, I'm very mindful of when I go to someone and I ask them to talk to me, when they take time with me, and I always thank people for their time, because that's the most valuable asset we have, mm-hmm. To make sure I get it right and to ask those questions, going back to my dad, that there's people are like, oh, well, that's a silly question. Well, you don't know until you ask, and it might not be silly. You might think it is, and you might think someone may judge you for asking a certain question, but sometimes you need to ask that question, mm-hmm. to have a better understanding of things. And so that's kind of how it started. And then I was supposed to start my internship actually September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
I ended up starting a few weeks after that. And then I started, my first on-air job was about 6 months later. I started in the Thumb, Bad Axe, at a AM/FM combo Actually became a country DJ and a polka DJ up there, and did news at night. And then I became assistant news director at a news talk in Saginaw, and then I went to Grand Rapids, and then I came home to Detroit and worked at WWJ, the station that I grew up listening to. And then I moved to Colorado, and then I came back, and now I work at WWJ. So it's been almost 19 years, and it's hard to believe that I've been able to basically make a living, except for a short period where I walked away for a while. For almost half my life I've been in this storytelling business.
That's great, and I mean, it sounds like you were pretty smart about the way you went about making a career for yourself, because I know, media has transformed during our lifetime, really during the time that you started doing it until now. It became a totally different business. And I've read and listened to a lot of stuff about that. I think I would have been a journalist if I would have done something else, which is, essentially what I'm doing right now by just talking to people. But, and I sort of relate to what you're saying, because there's a lot of times where I'll read something and I'll go, that could have been written a lot better, or that they left out something really important in this narrative. And, and I've thought about blogging and doing stuff like that for a long time, and kind of, just, this pandemic has really kind of lit a fire under me of like, well, I got time. I might as well start talking to people and start just doing what I've been waiting for all this time. But, one of the things I've been studying and learning about for several years is kind of the ways in which our media landscape is fragmented into these different silos, where I've heard it referred to as an epistemological crisis, where we have people sort of living out different narratives of reality based on the media that they're consuming, and it seemed to be very detrimental to a democratic society to have people be so polarized in terms of not just their views, but like what they even believe.
Sure.
And so it circling back to what we're dealing with right now, which is a health crisis, I'm seeing so much online of people not trusting the leadership, not trusting what they're reading in the media. A lot of people are very angry with the governor, and they think there's this media narrative to destroy the president, and that this is all part of that whole thing. So I wonder, from your perspective, first of all, does that stuff concern you? Do you think there's any way forward, for media to get more credibility, or to break through in places where people don't, listen to NPR, or don't actually follow, a broad spectrum of sources? Like, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think where it really started to kind of impact me was I realized very early on, like the first kind of breaks of this kind of splintering of audience kind of thing that you're talking about, was I had seen how cable news had reversed the idea of news. And what I mean by that is when you have a 24-hour-a-day channel and you need to fill it, doing actual journalism takes time. Like, to actually get sources and to go out and interview and write it up and all of that. I mean, it takes a lot to do it. And basically kind of what happened in people's heads, and I think part of this is kind of an educational issue, but I also think it's kind of it's cheaper and easier to do it issue, is that first off, from the cheaper and easier standpoint, cable news really inverted our concept of what news is. So for example, if cable news was actually going to be full-on news, it would be a lot more like 60 Minutes.
Mm-hmm.
It would be long-form package features explaining you a story and walking you through it. Instead, what you get are talking heads kind of opining on something, and then typically at the top of the hour on most of the cable stations, there's like a news update. There's like, 5 minutes of an anchor reading actual hard news stories. And then out of those hard news stories, they then opine for 55 minutes of the hour. So basically what they did was they inverted the newspaper model, because really kind of all journalism is kind of based on newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is it was the first form. It kind of set an idea of a structure. And if you look at any newspaper, there's an opinion editorial section that's a couple of pages, and then everything else is actual hard news, like
Mm-hmm.
actual reporting. And basically what cable news did was just invert the model. And by doing so, what it did is it really confused people. And how it confused people, I think, is because people are not media literate. I don't think they really teach this in school. And if you don't learn it at home or you don't learn it at school, you're not really going to understand that Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow are not really reporters.
Right.
They're just not.
Well, and real quick, I do need to stick up for the librarian at the school I work at, because she does a great job. She teaches media literacy to kids, and that's
so important. It's so important.
Something that is part of the curriculum, but it's not taught everywhere, and it's not done to the degree it could be in a lot of places. But I agree with you. I think that's a huge issue, is that people just don't know what they're looking at, and they find things, actually they're fed things that are already conforming to their worldview,
right?
And they don't seek out other stuff.
But you know what? That is nothing new, though, because newspapers, before the rise of objective journalism, and I'll put objective in quotes, that objective journalism really started as a way to bring in more advertisers.
Mm-hmm.
And it started mostly after the turn of the century. So newspapers originally, I mean, this is why you still see sort of vestigial pieces of it, the name of it, but I think it's in Arkansas. It's like the Arkansas Democrat. Why is it called the Arkansas Democrat? Well, because originally newspapers were house organs of political parties.
That's right.
So you knew that if you bought this paper versus this paper, you knew that this one was the pro-labor paper, and this one was the pro-business paper. So often they were assigned to political parties, and that's the way they were from basically the founding of the country forward up until the early part of the 20th century, in which the idea became, well, if we can do things objectively, then we can open this up to more people, and specifically more advertisers, because we knew that if one party versus another, certain advertisers would go one way or another. So it became a way to kind of handle that issue. So the idea of a splintering of an audience has always been there. There's always been partisans, and there always will be. Mm-hmm. The issue that we've had really has been over pretty much the last, I'd say, 35 years. And I would go back to, I think it was 1986, which was the ending of the Fairness Doctrine. So it kind of really starts there. So Reagan comes through to the FCC and says, right, get rid of the Fairness Doctrine. So the Fairness Doctrine had been, for example, if you were a political person who was running and you were a candidate, that meant that if we gave 5 minutes to that candidate, we had to give 5 minutes to every other candidate. So, and the idea was that if you were going to present this idea, you had to present the counterpoint idea. So the Fairness Doctrine was something that had been written into broadcast as far back as the 1920s when radio came in. So that got done away with. And when the Fairness Doctrine ended, it actually allowed for the rise of conservative talk radio, and specifically Rush Limbaugh. His entire career is based on the fact of two things. One, the Fairness Doctrine, and then number two, and he probably would not agree with this, but he did help him, was in 1996, Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act. The 1996 Telecommunications Act allowed for, as I talked about, one company I worked for to own 2,000 stations across the United States.
Right.
So originally, the Telecommunications Act made it very, very hard for one company to own multiple stations within a market. There were limits. So there still are kind of limits, but I mean, it really opened it up, and it allowed for basically mega conglomerates to come in, such as now known as iHeartMedia, but it was iHeartRadio, which had been Clear Channel, to own a bunch of stuff. And then there were all these other companies that just bought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stations all across the United States. And so the Telecommunications Act of 1996 really opened it up. And between the money issue, the end of the fairness doctrine, and then I sort of feel like not really getting into sort of media theory and understanding even how journalism is done. Like the average person, I don't think has a clue how a story goes from a journalist going, I'm going to go talk to these people, or someone gave me a tip, to an actual thing that's broadcast to you. I don't think most people even understand what goes into that.
Right.
And that is the thing that's maddening to me, because, you know, it would be a lot easier for me to just make things up, you know, and then get paid for it.
Right.
But I can't do that.
Right.
Like there are actual ethical rules in terms of how I do my job. And most people have no idea. And it is fascinating, like the ultimate reality that some people live on when it comes to journalism.
Some of this also, I don't know if you agree with this, but it kind of coincides with the collapse of the newspaper industry, and how so much, like you open up the Detroit Free Press and so much of it's just AP stories that are not reported by local people. There's a lot less journalism happening in even like, you know, the Tri-County area. It's mostly, they just don't have the staff that they used to have. And so a lot of stuff just isn't being reported on that's happening in people's local communities. And so there's just become more and more of a focus on national politics and things that are further away from people, and sort of disempower them from the issues that actually affect their lives.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's sad. It's because politics has become nationalized, and a lot of the reason why is for the reasons you state. Part of the way that newspapers were kind of destroyed, and this is why I find it ironic that he spent money at NYU, I believe it is, to start a journalism program, the Craig Newmark School of Journalism, is Craigslist. Now, most people don't realize this, but it was Craigslist that actually helped put the first kind of big dent in the armor of newspapers. Mm-hmm. Because before that, before Craigslist, before free advertising, you know, online, if you wanted to sell your car, or if you were trying to sell a house, or you were looking for, even if you were looking for a date, you know, you had to place an actual ad. You had to like pay newspapers to run classified ads. Mm-hmm. And now there really is no such thing. And that took a huge amount of money away from newspapers. And when that happened, it just completely shrunk it. I mean, and it's been sad for me, because when I came back in 2015 to Detroit from Colorado, I worked as a freelancer for the Free Press. I did a podcast for them. I did an arts and culture show in 15 and 16 for almost a year and a half. And I remember going into the building that they're in now, and there were people there. And I went there this spring, or not this spring, last fall, so about 6 months ago. And I was doing some training with them on some things. And there was a whole floor that, you know, they're like, we're going to meet in this room up here. And I walked through there and I'm like, there used to be people here. Yeah. Not here anymore. And that was just in a few short years. So it's sad, because one of the things that I think broadcast has done, and it doesn't matter where you work in broadcast, with rare exception, our material is not really saved in broadcast. Now, some of the major networks and things like that might have a library. Some major stations may have a library, but by and large, local stations and that, they don't have a library of their material. So at least all the stations I worked at in radio never did. If I wasn't keeping my own stuff, it didn't exist. So I was actually pretty good to keep my archives. But we had sort of advocated this idea of sort of the first draft of history, which is what I consider news to be, to the newspapers. That they were going to be there, they were going to write it up. That would be the stuff that would be saved onto those microfilms and all of that I talked about when I was a kid doing research on my dad. And sadly, a lot of that's fallen off. So, what I'm really concerned about, and it may seem like an odd concern, is that as we live so much of our life digitally, as opposed to an actual hard copy version of it, it can be edited and shoved down the memory hole. Go read 1984 if you don't remember what that is, or it just disappears because nobody bothers to pay for the server space anymore, and it's gone. And I'm really concerned about that, because the one thing that I've been looking for in this whole kind of outbreak that we're dealing with is to try and learn from great calamities of the past and things that have happened to us as humanity, to try and figure out, well, we've been here before, so that it doesn't feel like we're all alone, like we've never been through something like this, and like what worked well last time, and what didn't.
Right.
Sort of, how can we go forward in the future knowing what we know from past calamity, and instead of having to reinvent the wheel every time something bad happens. And that's really what I think is important about having a record of humanity. And I think that that's really what journalism at its best should be. It should be a record of humanity, our faults, how we fall, how we pick each other up, how we aspire to things,
And that's interesting, because you're not just saying that as an opinion. You actually have done a lot of things to archive a lot of history of our community, especially the arts. So do you just want to talk about that? Because you've done several things in different forms of media to archive things that have gone on, and to try to keep them in the memory of of people now and people beyond in the future. So talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, for me, kind of where all that starts out, it was a columnist at the local paper where I worked at in Bad X, and the tip of the thumb, and he got fired for writing on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. He wrote a column basically criticizing the concept, and he got fired for it. And I interviewed him, and that was sort of the beginning. Was I was like, I want to just tell these first person stories. And then when I was working in that area, I also heard about a woman who had made a complaint to her county commission and was shouted down and told basically she didn't deserve to speak, to have her 5 minutes, and she ended up suing them. So I did a full feature documentary on her. I think I spent about 5 years working on that case. And then sort of that really got my idea of, we should really kind of take these stories of people who do things, and it doesn't have to be drastic. It can be small things, so that we can better understand each other and our own motivations. I mean, I think for myself, if someone were to ask me years ago why I got into journalism, I would just say, well, radio seemed like better than working in a machine shop, which was most of the kids that I grew up around. But ultimately, what I think it is for me was I was always trying to figure out why people did what they did, so that I could understand why I do what I do, and kind of how we can make the world a better place. So that's probably where all that comes from. But anyway, so I did this feature doc, and then I think what you're talking about, and I referenced it already a little bit, was Orbit magazine. When I was in high school in the 90s, there were two magazines that I used to read, and it was Motor Booty. Whenever it came out, they only did like 9 issues. Sometimes it'd be several years between issues, but whenever that one came out, and then Orbit every month. And Orbit was just this great connector to the arts and culture community here. It had its ear closer to the ground because the staff were all artists and musicians and writers, and so they knew they were kind of hip, and they knew what was going on. And so in 20, a friend of mine who I was talking with him, and I was like, man, I remember Orbit. I loved it. I wonder if that stuff still holds up. I'd love to go back through it and take a look at it, and someone ought to tell that story. And he introduced me to the editor over at Wayne State University Press. We put together a proposal. I went to her. I said, this is what I want to do. And he also introduced me to Jerry Vile, who was the publisher and went on to do the Dirty Show, which now Dirty Show's in 21 years. It's his longest running thing that he's done every February. So anyway, I spent about 3.5 years doing the Orbit book. So it was reprints and history of 3 magazines that Jerry had a hand in from the late 70s to the late 90s, and reprints from all 3 magazines, and kind of telling this cultural history basically from sort of first wave, new wave, late 70s Detroit punk rock through to about the year 2000. So that was really important to me. And then out of that, what I realized is this scene that the magazine, the first magazine that Jerry did called White Noise, which was a Detroit punk zine, basically, that whole scene had kind of been forgotten. And I understand why it was forgotten, because there were no big bands that came out of it. Probably the best known band that came out of it, and they don't sound like any other band in there, is the Romantics. So most people know the Romantics, even if they just heard them on the radio. But that was the only band that kind of made it out of the bookies scene. And I knew that there was something else back there. Like, people had written about the hardcore scene a little bit before, and then the Grandy scene, the Grandy Ballroom with the Stooges and the MC5 and all that stuff in the late 60s and early 70s. So this scene kind of just got eclipsed. It kind of seemed like this thing that, you had, like I often joke about, do you know the movie The Conversation?
Mm-mm. No,
Okay, well, you should go check it out. It's Gene Hackman, 1972, The Conversation. So the reason why a lot of people don't know The Conversation was because Francis Ford Coppola made 2 really big films in between. He made The Godfather 1 and The Godfather 2. Right. So The Conversation kind of gets overshadowed by these twin towers of The Godfather, right? So it's kind of the same thing, where there was this punk rock scene that was there, but it gets overshadowed by the Grandy and the hardcore. And I get it. I understand why. But that scene in there was really interesting to me. And specifically, even beyond the bands, was that the guy who started working to book the little jazz club on McNichols, Bookies, which was called Bookies Club 870, eventually went to open St. Andrews Hall. So he started really a club scene in Detroit, because at the time in the 70s, there was like bar bands that had to be cover bands. And then there were guys playing at Kobo and the Masonic.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. There was like big bands, and then there was bar bands.
Yeah.
In between. So if you were a creative person, it was very hard for you to put a band together and to do anything with it.
Right.
Until these guys came around and said, we're going to open a bar. Anyone can play. Come bring people down here. And it really opened it up, so that by the time we come around, it's normal for, a bar to have original bands playing original songs, not playing covers.
Right.
So they kicked the door open in a really big way, and I don't think they were ever really given any credit for it. So for me, I did this thing. It's called the Detroit Punk Archive. You can find it online, DetroitPunkArchive.com. And I got some funding from the Knight Foundation matching grant, and I've got a record set that's coming out. It's been delayed a little bit because of the virus issue. But it's like a museum. You can go there, you can see the various venues, you can listen to stories and interviews. There's all the various bands that were in the scene, and you can kind of learn about them, where they came from. You can hear their stories. And really, that's what I tried to create, was kind of a virtual online museum where you can go in and check this stuff out and really kind of learn a little bit more about this period and why it was so important.
That's awesome. It's really cool. Yeah, that's it's a really good point about how important venues and people who start them are to a music scene, and how you know, we've both seen places come and go, and a lot of times the place is sort of the underrated like thing that makes a scene happen. And you know, we kind of just go, well, whatever, it's just the people. But it's not just the people, it's also like where they can go to congregate and feel comfortable being themselves and be allowed to do what they do, you know.
Yeah. And I mean, for myself, like I'm 42, and when I first was able to go out was to go to the Gold Dollar. So for those who aren't from Detroit, the Gold Dollar it was a show bar originally. So they would have kind of dancers and stuff, and they had jazz groups, and it was built in the 50s, 40s, 50s, but by the 60s it became a drag bar. So it became a drag bar into the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. It closed, and this guy bought it, and he reopened it, and it became the place where the White Stripes played, Electric Six, which then was called the Wild Bunch, like all these great local bands in the late 90s that were considered sort of a garage rock revival, like when Detroit really got on the map in that scene. Thanks really to the UK. Like, you really cannot underestimate the value of John Peel at the BBC and British writers who understood what was happening here better than we did.
Yeah.
You know, and that's another thing that I talk about with this town, is that I love Detroit, but we have this problem with ourselves that it's there's this quote that the German filmmaker Werner Herzog talks about why his movies aren't popular in Germany. They always do well overseas. And he says, well, Germans hate their own poets. So I think like Detroit kind of hates its own poets until someone with an accent tells them it has value.
Right.
So, I mean, it was like that with the Stooges and the MC5. It was the Ramones and Motorhead and the Sex Pistols and the Clash and all of those guys who said, oh yeah, Iggy and the Stooges, Iggy Pop, fucking MC5, that stuff's great. So it's the same thing with techno. Like there was a lot of people that were into techno in Detroit, but it really didn't take off until you had people in France and in the UK saying, oh yeah, that stuff's really good. Or like I said, with the White Stripes, I mean, John Peel at the BBC heard some of their first stuff and said, that's it.
Yeah.
And wrote about them and talked about them and played their stuff. And then they come back and then they get respect at home.
Yeah, there's this weird perception thing, I think. Like, I have friends who've toured in Europe and, you know, played packed shows over there, and then they can't even, you know, make money off of a show here. And you know, I've been told before, like, yeah, man, if you just, you know, if you wanted to tour, all you got to do is like book like 2 shows in France or in Germany or something, and after that, like, you'll just book other stuff while you're over there, and you can just pretty much stay as long as you want. And you know, and I know people who've done it, and it's kind of wild because there's just the name Detroit carries this cachet with it in other places that it doesn't here. And the music scene is just different in other places where there's a little bit more. I think there's like an expectation in America sometimes about what a musician looks like and how they present themselves. And in Europe, my understanding of it is it's just more about the music itself and not the personality or the style of dress or, like, you know, how this person comes off. It's just like, do I like what they're playing? And you know, there's more of like a dance culture. And one of my best friends has put out multiple records on European labels, and like nobody here knows who he is, and he doesn't play out here. He just like makes stuff in his house, and then like he makes house music, but it's like literal house music because he just doesn't like leave his house to do it. But like he you know, he gets on like DJ charts out there and stuff, and like, you know, DJs buy his records, and he doesn't really make like a lot of money off of it, but he's got labels being like, yeah, we'll put out, you know, give us a project, we'll put it out. And like, it's just kind of crazy. The way
I think part of it is our own fault. a little bit here in Detroit. And I can't remember if he says the quote in my interview with him for the Detroit Punk Archive or not. But I interviewed Don Was, and those who don't know Don Was, his bass player he's the president of Blue Note Records now, which is the beautiful antique, not antique, but beautiful, huge jazz label. You can get away with having like an attitude and a style in Los Angeles or New York and driving around in limos, but it's like not in Detroit.
Yeah.
Like a very working class, like we're all in this together. So who are you to put on a show kind of thing, don't be pretentious,
Yeah.
So I think part of it is our like, don't be pretentious attitude, or it's like, oh, that guy, because to be honest, like even with Jack, who I've gotten to know a little bit better in recent years since he opened, the Third Man store and all of that back here, back in the day when he was getting that attention from the BBC and all that, I'm like, really? That guy? So I mean, even I was, when I was young, kind of, I think we are so lucky to be from here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people forget that. I think we become so it becomes kind of wallpaper to us. And it's sad because it shouldn't be, because there's so many great artists and so much great talent that comes from here. And on a lot of levels, whether it be music or it be creative or film or something like that. Like I have friends who live in Los Angeles who work in the film and television industry, and they call them the Michigan Mafia, because there's a lot of great creative people out in Los Angeles that come from here.
Yeah.
So we just kind of go, nah,
Even when you get outside of Detroit, like my when LXL had a chance to play up in like Bay City a few times, and when you go up there, it's like people come from like 45 minutes away to these shows, and they just like appreciate it on a level that like you just don't get in Detroit, because they don't get stuff like that all the time, and they can't go out any night of the week and find talented people playing original music, and they don't get like a hip hop and anything up there. So, there's a guy up there, another journalist, qWARRENtine, who works for MLive, and he's involved with like a lot of, he does like he helps organize a film and music festival up there every year, and then they do like indie shows a few times a year under this sort of banner, and it's always good. Like it's just always a good time, and people come from like Midland and Saginaw and like all these places because they know like I'm going to see a good show. And here it's like there might be 5 things going on in one night, and you do everything you need to do to like promote something and make it a thing, and then nobody shows up, and because there's something else going on that's right down the street. So yeah, it's very
it really, yeah, it's an embarrassment of riches. It's really an embarrassment of riches at times here. And you really only get that when you get people from out of town or people visiting from other countries. Like one of the most fascinating things was when they did sort of those Northern Soul things, where they got these guys from the UK who came over, like older folks who grew up listening to Motown, and not just Motown, but like small little indie label stuff, and they show up, and someone's in their 70s or 80s, who's going to sing, and they're like, oh, I bought his record in 1965. It was amazing, and can't believe I'd ever meet him, and all this. I mean, it's amazing to kind of see things through other people's eyes. I mean, one of my favorite nights every week on Tuesday, and sadly, because of what's going on, I haven't been able to go back, is every Tuesday night at Northern Lights, not too far from the Motown Museum, right there in New Center. Dennis Coffey will play guitar for free. You can go in and you can see Dennis Coffey. He's, and for those who don't know who he is, Just My Imagination, the guitar line, that's him. All that psychedelic era Temptation stuff, Ball of Confusion, Papa was a Rolling Stone, like all of that stuff. I mean, that's the guitar sound, man. That's the guy, you know.
Yeah,
So, and he's in his 70s. He's like 75 years old, but he'll go up there and he'll play, he'll play those hits, and he'll play like jazz stuff, and just with a great backup band. And you can go see him for free every Tuesday night. I mean, it's just an embarrassment of how much wonderful stuff we have here.
yeah, it's pretty amazing. So, how's this situation like impacting your ability to do your work? Because your work is talking to people and interviewing them in person and things like that. So, how are you having to adapt?
Well, the last 2 weeks, we've been doing this kind of 2 weeks in the station, 2 weeks at home of work. Um, the thing that's good for me is I have like as close to kind of a full setup as I need here at home. So I do a lot of phone interviews, and then I can do it that way. I'm not able, obviously, to get out and talk to people face to face, but that's really been the thing, you know. I think more than anything, the hardest thing for me during this time as a journalist to do the work is that, and it may sound slightly bad, but just kind of go with me on this, is when I started was when September 11th happened. And that was kind of what kind of put it in my head, how you like going through a crisis and long form coverage and all of that stuff. But that was New York, and that was Washington, D.C., and that was Pennsylvania. And I wasn't working in those places. So I could come home and I could kind of get away from it a little bit. I mean, it was there, it was in the ether, but there was a distance. There was a little bit of a distance. With something like this, it just feels like, for lack of a better term, like, most people will take a glass and they'll go to the tap, or, get a drink of water. They go to the water fountain and get a little thing, and that's their news. Me, it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's just constantly spraying at me. And when I shut it off for the day, working at home, I'm still in it. I've got to, watch how I touch my face, or like where I'm going, or what I'm touching, or there's all these things that you have to be mindful of. And it makes it hard, because sometimes when I cover news, it feels like there's a space
Mm-hmm.
for me, and then there's the world, and that space is narrowed, and it makes it hard some days. It can be emotionally exhausting, especially when you're hearing everything. Like I said, people have a choice as to how much they get.
Mm-hmm.
I know some people that don't even watch the news. They're not listening to it. They've tuned out of social media. They're like not engaging with it because it's just too much. And I understand that. It's just hard when you're in it and doing it day to day. I don't have the luxury of doing that.
Right.
And like last year, I had a moment where I wrote in my journal that sometimes I feel like my job is to take really horrible shit and to explain it to people without emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really hard, because some of this stuff is just horrible. And I'm not just talking about this situation we're dealing with. I'm talking about all kinds of things. Someone gets killed, maybe there's a murder story, or maybe there's, political corruption, or something. I mean, we know about kids being underfed, schools are underfunded. It's all these things. And when you take a minute to just sit down and think about the impact on an individual of these stories, of these things that they're living through, it can be a lot. And it's hard sometimes. And I try my best, I try not to let that through too much, because it can cripple you. It can make it hard to do your job.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think I've dealt with that a little bit as a teacher too, just the things that your students are going through, and I've had sleepless nights before worrying about a student, or something that happened, and
or like you said, about explaining things without emotion. Sometimes you'll get asked a question and you just want to break down because of
Yeah.
how, especially with kids, they can ask questions in very pointed ways that kind of cut through the bullshit of how an adult might talk about it. And you just want to be like, I wish I could protect you from the truth of the answer to this question, but I can't. And I think there's definitely times where you just kind of walk out and you're like, man, I don't know how to like leave that behind for the day. So it's definitely something that,
Hard.
yeah, it is
I
hard.
mean, it's, it, it just comes with being human. I think, anyone who, I think anyone who has the jobs that we have wants a better place. They see things, they see the injustices, they see the things that are wrong, and they want a better world. They want a better place for people to live. I mean, you should, you
That's
know.
a that's a good segue into kind of how I like to wrap up these interviews. Is what do you hope, or what in your future, once this pandemic is over, what do you hope changes? Because I think a lot of people have sort of this like hope that some things will be permanently different, and they also have this fear that everything's just going to go back to normal. And I think that there's a lot of people who are very dissatisfied with life in America in 2020, and in the world at large. So many injustices have been ripped open, and so many we just know so much more than we ever did, whether people choose to engage with it or not. It's more in our faces. And so what do you hope, when you look out at a better world after this, that you see change from it?
It may be a little bit of a roundabout way for me to get there, but I'm going to go back and kind of talk about a couple of things that I talked about on the show in the first week. At the end of the first week of shows that I did, as this was really ramping up, kind of my sign off that week, I talked about how it was just the beginning. I knew this basically, to me, it was like kind of watching a weather map. What I mean by that is it was kind of like watching a hurricane come. You didn't know when exactly or where it was going to hit, but you knew it was going to hit. And since you hadn't been through something like that, I have no personal knowledge or skills. So I had to go back to lessons that I learned from my grandparents and their stories. And on my mother's side, my grandparents on that side survived being bombed by the Germans in Aberdeen in Scotland, in the early 1940s during the war. And I remember stories of deprivation and death, and my grandfather returning to the shipyard where he worked and having to pull the bodies of his coworkers out and finding limbs and all, just all kinds of horrible stuff. And then my grandfather on my dad's side here in the US surviving, living through the Great Depression as a child, as a teenager, and then becoming a member of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and then being drafted and then fighting in the Pacific in World War II and being wounded. So I was kind of like thinking to myself, I go, I've never known war. I've never known invasion. Americans have never known invasion. We've never known that. I've never known war. I've never been handed a rifle and sent off. Scarcity, the way that my grandparents did in the UK, when there was rationing, when you only got so much and, had to deal with that. Or in my grandfather here during the Great Depression, living through the Depression and everything, that was a deprivation. So My hope is, and I look at the scenario and I just kind of shake my head sometimes, and I may be completely wrong, and I hope I am. But there's a feeling that I kind of get from some people that they think as soon as we can, we will turn the lights back on and everything will go back to the way it was. That everyone's jobs will be there, everything will be the same. And I don't think so. I think that what we're going to really have to understand is that we may want something like happened during my grandparents' day, and that there may be these forms of deprivation and scarcity, and we may have to consider.
This is how a Saturday night in the deep sounds. They bang hip-hop, gridlocked in Greektown. The beat cops looking for somebody to beat down. They got no control, who's running the streets now? They shutting all the schools and the factories been closed. Only thing open is the busted out windows. Whole blocks looking like they got bombed and missiles. They say the city's dying, well let's make it official. Cause the history says that when this story ends, a new one begins. We like new
under our roads, such as sewer systems. I mean, there's water mains that break in Detroit every winter that date back 150 years.
Yeah.
You know, so we have infrastructure needs. So maybe we need to create a works program, a federal works program, like what FDR did to build things, because people might not have jobs.
Yeah.
You know, and their jobs may be digging sewers and fixing roads.
Yeah.
And my grandfather was part of the Civilian Conservation Corps with men, and they, you know, my grandfather helped to plant trees in the UP and helped to build a road that goes around Lake Superior. You know, it was part of his encampment. We may need something like that. I'm not saying that we will, but I think that some of these older methods may have to come back in some way. And
I've seen them kicking around that idea at the federal level already, talking about you know, infrastructure and jobs. And you know, one of the people who commented on it was Mark Cuban, the famous billionaire, who said, you know, if we're going to do that, we really need to look at building infrastructure for the future, not just rebuilding stuff that's broken, but like, you know, thinking about the world as it's going to look 100 years from now versus, well, let's just rebuild our highways and roads and everything the same as it was, because we're really so you know, I think it could be an opportunity where there may be, you know, finally like the political circumstances to have that kind of investment, because otherwise, you know, and I think we've already seen an example, you know, 12 years ago of a stimulus that didn't go far enough and really could have been, there wasn't the politics to make that happen. And now I think there is. So it'll be very interesting to see where that goes. But so anyway,
this time is a very hard time in that, you know, there's still a lot that we don't know. And part of the problem I think that we have in our media landscape to a certain extent, when we talk about, as I was saying, sort of this model that switched from the opinion to the hard news, is that, or the other way around, from hard news to opinion, is that a lot of the people that opine try to opine from a position of, I know, or I'm an authority, I know. The thing is we don't know. You know, like the confirmed cases we have are the ones that are tested. Those are just the ones that are tested. We don't know how many people have the illness. We don't know. Mm-hmm. We don't know exactly where, we know where certain hotspots are based on where certain people are flooding, you know, emergency rooms. But there's still questions in terms of, like when I had the conversation with my friend who was a nurse who got a case of it, I go, so do you now have the antibodies and you're fine? You're not going to get, sick again? And she's like, I don't know. There could be another strain of this that I could get. Or, we just don't know. There's just not enough data yet. And part of the thing is that within those gaps of the data that we don't know is where people can speculate and they can make wrong guesses and they can do things that are not necessarily beneficial. And part of the problem is it's such a fast moving thing that we're in right now. And it's such a disruption that people just want answers. They just want answers now and they just want it fixed. But the problem is that we can't fix it that fast. We can't fix it fast enough.
Yeah.
And we're all losing our patience a little bit, with it. But it's nobody's fault, really. It's just the state of play that we find ourselves in. And that's why, like I was talking about, I think before we recorded, when I go to the store and someone's a little edgy or, they get loud or they, something happens, I try to take a minute and go, it's okay. Like, I understand the stress we're all under.
Right.
And I think I would like to come out the other end more than anything, whether we end up with any of these projects or healthcare or any of those political things. The thing that I would like to see coming out the other end is maybe we're a little bit nicer to each other, and that we take care of each other a little better, because if we can't do that, then really everything is kind of off. I mean, we all got to share this place together, and we should try to make it as cool of a place as we can and as good as we can for everyone. And if we can't do that, then really, what are we doing? That's the thing that I always try to think is, I mean, I'm a kid who grew up listening to metal and going to hardcore punk shows. And I tell people, I go, really, like, the world is kind of like a mosh pit, it's like this swirling mass of people. And sometimes people trip and they fall, and some people push people down. But if someone falls down, man, put your fucking hand down and pull them up and be like, are you all right? All right, good. Give them a hug or whatever. And they want to go back in the pit, great. If they want to go back and get some water or get a drink, it's great too. But, like, pull each other up. That's really what I think we need to do more than anything.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and you're definitely someone making the world a cooler place. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And and I'm gonna put links to all your stuff in the notes of wherever I end up posting this. And so far I've just been posting to YouTube, but I'm sure I'm gonna post it as a podcast at some point too. So I appreciate all you're doing, and I enjoy when I get a chance to hear you on the radio, and and all the projects that you're doing are really cool, and serving an important purpose to archive our history. So thanks for all you do, and take care and be safe.
Saturday night in the deep sounds. They bang hip-hop, gridlocked in Greektown. The beat cops looking for somebody to beat down. They got no control, who's running the streets now? They shutting all the schools and the factories been closed. Only thing open is the busted out windows. Whole blocks looking like they got bombed and missiles. They say the city's dying, well let's make it official, cause the history says that when this story ends, a new one begins. We like new